I feel partly culpable through having a penis.
You are.
Yeah, I am. I definitely am. I've done so much bad stuff. I've got to atone for it somewhere.
So for the uninitiated, International Non Wassocks Day is an imaginary social justice campaign day invented by comedian Richard Herring in support of International Women's Day, which precedes it by 2 days. The farcical notion of an International Non Wassocks Day was conceived as an extension to the joke that informs Herring's social justice activism in support of International Women's Day. His narrative is essentially this. The United Nations encourage the world to celebrate women, their achievements, and the unique challenges they face for 24 hours of the 8,760 annually available on March the 8th, International Women's Day. Herring, meanwhile, has observed that a remarkable number of people take to Twitter every year on International Women's Day and cynically ask why there isn't an International Men's Day. He caricatures these tweeters as furious, chauvinistic cheese helmets who are so distracted by the opportunity to manufacture injustice out of the existence of International Women's Day that they are either too stupid or too lazy to take the time out of their privileged day to search out the fact that there actually is an International Men's Day, and it's on November the 19th. He also argues that such nonsense distracts focus away from International Women's Day, to the extent that March the 8th has become International Idiot Men saying International Women's Day, when's International Men's Day? From Herring's perspective, asking why there isn't an International Men's Day is a transparently self-centered act, especially when the question is asked on International Women's Day. In his experience, men maintain such patriarchal privilege that every day is effectively International Men's Day, and he therefore proposes that the least men could do is celebrate women on International Women's Day instead of having to make it all about themselves. As a compromise, he has suggested that on the day after International Women's Day, we should observe International Wassocks Day, which should be a day for all the people who ask why there isn't an International Men's Day on International Women's Day. For a 24-hour period, they can say whatever they like, and no one can complain or get offended by their words. Finally, he argues that some of those Wassocks will inevitably ask why there isn't an International Non-Wassocks Day, so he also observes a day for all the non-Wassocks who don't ask why there isn't an International Men's Day on International Women's Day. Hence, International Non-Wassocks Day.
See, men like to talk a good game, but they don't realise that equality isn't just about pushing someone forward, it's also about pushing some people back.
Yes.
Take a step backwards.
Yeah.
Given the amount of media coverage Herring's antics generate for him, some feminists have begun to think that March the 8th has effectively been turned into International Richard Herring Day, while others argue that International Richard Herring Day should genuinely be celebrated on March the 10th in order to acknowledge his monumental selfless act of Twitter pedantry and virtue signalling undertaken in support of International Women's Day. Other critics believe that International Richard Herring Day should be held on March the 9th, on International Wassocks Day, given his open disdain for the notion of encouraging champions of gender equality to spend 24 hours of the 8,760 annually available promoting positive messages about men and reflecting on some of the unique challenges they face, instead of shamelessly insisting that every day is International Men's Day for every man. Champions of gender equality have observed that International Women's Day has been successfully utilised to help challenge conscious and unconscious bias about women for decades, and that although the concept of promoting an International Men's Day is comparatively new, both campaigns will inevitably continue to challenge chauvinism and celebrate positive stories about the sexes long after Richard Herring tires of obsessively admonishing his fellow social media users for their perceived privilege and sexism.
But feminism. People have a problem with the word feminism having fem in it, I guess. But it's insanely, because obviously, well, as you say, it's like having a White History Month, or having saying, well, you've done all this stuff about slaves, but when are we going to hear about the slave owners and have a day for them? And HIV Awareness Day. I haven't got AIDS. When will there be a day for me? And it's the same, it is the same
exactly
thing.
the same.
Well, the truth is, as well, if you're in, and that's what you get, that's what I get a lot now.
Yeah.
Is, do you not care about male suicide? I go, yeah, I do care about male suicide. I've done lots of gigs for Calm, and, it's an important subject. But if you conflate it into this thing, which is men complaining about there being an International Women's Day, you're actually devaluing all of those very good points.
Absolutely.
Nobody on an International Men's Day is going, hooray, here it is, let's go for it, which is sort of what I'm interested in seeing. Why are all these people asking about it on one day and then doing nothing about it when it turns up?
I'm like,
even when you've told them.
On.
And a day for equality is a day for everyone anyway.
Yeah.
So if you're having a day where everyone's equal, that includes the guys. So that includes.
Yeah, just get on board.
But I might make it the last one.
Men like to talk a good game, but they don't realise that equality isn't just about pushing someone forward. It's also about pushing some people back.
Yes.
Take a step backwards.
Yeah.
For me, the most wazzocky thing about Richard Herring's entirely wazzocky antics on International Women's Day is that as much as he keeps on insisting that it's the people he picks on that have a problem with a day about equality, his annual utterances make it plain to anyone paying the remotest bit of attention that he clearly has a massive problem with a day about equality, and is therefore at the very least as big a wazzock as the people he publicly shames. Personally, I stopped following Richard's comedy career a couple of years ago, on the exact same day that he rather childishly blocked me on Twitter after I suggested that he wanted to have his cake and eat it, at the end of a very frustrating chat, where he had entirely unconvincingly tried to claim that he doesn't have a problem with the concept of people spending 24 hours of the 8,760 annually available promoting positive messages about men. That said, I do like to check in with him on a twice annual basis for the specific purpose of documenting his latest logic for continuing his annual act of condescension, virtue signalling and self-promotion. Because I'm pretty sure that by now Richard realises that he's created a bit of a monster, and consequently I'm fascinated to see how he's going to attempt to extract himself from the massive hole he's been digging for quite some time. And even though some feminists may never tire of a man telling other men that they're stupid and selfish, an awful lot of people just don't get his joke. The men and women working patiently and tirelessly on International Men's Day over the past decade obviously aren't convinced by his claim that he's done more to positively promote International Men's Day than anyone else in the world. Egalitarian supporters of human rights in general generally think that he wants to have his cock and eat it. And given that his fan base is largely drawn from his target demographic, inevitably each year some of them are switched off by the jag in his joke. But even a lot of fellow feminists can't stand it and feel that a man presuming to protect his sisters on Women's Day is kind of missing the point, especially when it's a man who insists on talking incessantly about Men's Day to the extent that he's making headlines and a trending hashtag on Twitter. So even though this year he has belatedly managed to inject some element of positive karma into proceedings by raising money for charity, I wasn't remotely surprised to learn that he sheepishly indicated that this year may be his last during his recent love-in with the second most famous hater of November the 19th. Personally, I don't care what he does next year, but I will be interested to see if he follows through with his plan for November.
I think this year I might just try. There must be some way on Twitter I can mark them all down and say, what are we doing tomorrow on November the 18th?
Just put them in a group. There's a way of putting people in a group.
There must be some way of doing it.
Yeah, there is. I will get onto Twitter for you for that.
Some of us already have a good idea for him if he's being remotely serious, but then again, obviously he's not. So I wanted to do a quick response video addressing some of the more dubious claims that came up during his recent interview with Jess Phillips. And while it's tempting to take the time to pick their shared narrative apart point by point, I thought it would be better to take a more direct approach instead. So after setting the scene with a couple of Jess Phillips's most audacious claims, I'm going to leave the talking to the wise old woman who started the worldwide women's refuge movement, founded the charity that Richard has just very generously fundraised for, and is an infinitely much better champion for gender equality than Richard on any and all gendered days of the year.
But the thing is about the left or the liberal elite is that we are less willing to use dirty tactics. We are less willing to lie our way to a result. And we are less willing to use fear and to exploit weakness in order to achieve what we want to achieve. Now, but there was a time when I was first elected, before I had sort of kicked off at Twitter, where it was constant, like thousands of messages every hour, just that you're going to be killed, stuff about my kids being hung, stuff about me being raped in all different ways, or how I was not suitable for a raping, which apparently is better. That's a low bar as well. So yeah, I get an awful lot of that. But the worst stuff, actually, that you get, the most dangerous stuff, is the stuff that is just like, it's the shut up stuff. It's trying to silence you all the time, so that when you go to say something, you think twice about it, and that is dangerous.
Yeah, yeah.
Ha ha, you don't know. Ha ha, you don't know about November the 19th. Ha ha, you don't know about the day when nothing happens. Ha ha, you guys are idiots for not knowing about a thing that I don't give a shit about.
And it often happens when you talk about women's aid. People are like, oh, well, where's men's aid? I'm like that. Well, tell you what, get a squat, put a mattress on the floor, have jumble cells for the entirety of the 80s, which was how we funded the women's movement, and then maybe we'll take you seriously. Set up your own refuge. Get on with it, mate.
Yeah.
Don't just be moaning at me because I did something good.
So there we were, penniless women and children, most of them arriving with their stuff in black bags and nothing else on their backs. And somehow we had to survive. Well, it got to where it was bursting. Women were sleeping with their backs against the wall, their heads on the knees, and all the mattresses on the floor. The children would lie there like little herrings, all in rows. And then we would get food from the shops, would give us food left over. And so the butchers, everybody down Chiswick High Road helped. It was an amazing time. And then one day, this man came in and he said, what do you really need? Turns out he owned a huge construction company, because by now the news was getting out.
Yeah.
The local vicar was calling me a marriage wrecker. Member of Parliament stood up in House of Commons and was very embarrassed by my behaviour. And it didn't matter. He bought us a huge house, which was overcrowded before we moved in.
Sorry, do you mind if I ask a question there?
Okay, yeah.
The local vicar was calling you a marriage wrecker for providing a shelter for abused women.
Yes.
That's, I mean, I guess it's a difference in time, isn't it?
Yeah, every single agency in England, family agency, everybody knew it was going on. Nobody talked about it. Nobody. And so when the press suddenly picked it up, the local press first of all, and then the national press, it began a huge argument that these are women who are basically, there's nothing wrong with them, they're provoking it, they want it, they need it, they like it. I remember a newspaper calling them battered chicken. Battered chicks, that was it. It was considered funny to begin with. I knew once the money started coming in and the public started sending us funds, we could never get any government funds. For a very short period of time I had some, but it was taken away because I was illegal from the very beginning, grossly overcrowded, and I had warrants out for my arrest for the overcrowding from the very beginning of the opening of the refuge. So what happened is that I knew that eventually there would be the tramping of the feminist militant boots coming my way because they were running out of funding. It was no longer fashionable. The newspapers were tired of it. So there wasn't the endless amount of funding raising, because you had to pay £3.10 to join the Women's Liberation Movement, which is a lot of money in those days.
I can believe it, yeah.
Yeah, and anyway, that was running out, so they needed a new funding source. And of course, the tragedy for me of all this, and my vision, was that it fell into their hands, because perfect. They had a cause, women as victims of all men's violence, and they would be funded because they would start refuges, which is what they did across the Western world. From the very beginning, it was nothing to do with women and violence. It was a fundraising event, which is now, I think, a Violence Against Women Act in America. I think they get $2 billion a year. And that doesn't even go to refugees. It goes directly into the pockets of the radical feminists to spend on funding their political movement, which gets bigger and bigger and bigger every year. And at the bottom level was the original statement that so frightened me, which is that marriage is a dangerous place for women. And the refuges and shelters, as they call them in America, really became bunkers for radicalizing vulnerable women. As far as the men were concerned, this was a women's issue, so you only ended up with feminist journalists who were never going to publish anything like that. And also the world of publishing. I wrote Scream Quietly or The Neighbours Will Hear, which is the first book in the world there was no literature on domestic violence, which has been out of print for years. And I had terrible trouble getting it published. But what saved me was the film, actually. It went out late at night when Edward Heath had electricity was and televisions were mostly off, but at least enough people saw it. And then overnight there was an explosion. But of course that brought with it the politicizing of the problem of domestic violence. And so it was, when it did explode, it exploded. And what saved me was actually, because the press wouldn't let it go, was we had sufficient donations from the public to keep going. And then we had to become the biggest squatting agency in England. In those days it was legal. And we owned houses all over England. We used to take housing that had been tarted up by the local boroughs, and they just left them empty. So we took them. And we had a big hotel in Richmond. It was the Palm Court Hotel. It had 45 private suites. And apart from the crisis refuge, that was a second stage refuge. So women could stay as long as they liked until they got rehoused. Because for many women who had been so brutalized as children, it would take 4 or 5 years before they were actually comfortable to move out and begin to make a life of their own with their children.
Understandable. Okay, so what was the feminist reaction to your newfound popularity?
Just completely, what happened in 1974, again, I was very naive. We all were, the mums and me, because we weren't political. I was religious, but not political. And we had a little, knowing that there were other refuges and desperate to get other refuges going, we actually convened a little conference, which we thought we were convening, in our local church hall, where groups from across England were encouraged to come so that we could share our information with each other. Much to our horror, me and my mums, there's a very good group who were like us from Ireland, from Southern Ireland. In came these women who we were terrified of them, and they had a whole sound system with them, and they just marched in and they just took over the whole thing. They started voting all these. None of us had ever we didn't even know what to say. We didn't even understand what was going on. But what they did, they voted themselves into the National Federation of Women's Aid and called themselves that they were the charity, which is, was completely untrue.
So they just directly co-opted it.
Yeah.
In front of everyone's faces.
Yes. And I remember Jenny, one of my mums, she was sitting on the floor and she looked at them all and she screamed at them, "The only working class women you know are the women who clean your houses," which didn't go down very well. And I shall draw a veil over what the other women said to them, because you can't say it on television. They were outraged.
I can imagine that everyone can imagine the sort of things they were saying.
Yeah, and many of the women were radical lesbians, and they were the ones that were most vociferous about family life. And as worms turn.
What were their positions on it then?
Well, if anybody who sleeps with your husband, you're actually sleeping with the enemy.
Sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but that sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, these people actually think of it as some kind of gender war.
They meant it. They meant it.
Wow.
That as far as men were concerned, that any time a woman sleeps with a man, she's raped. And so in those early days, I realized I had two problems. I had the problems who were actually of the women themselves who were physically violent and to their children and emotionally violent. Then I had a much smaller problem, which is the women who were innocent victims of their partner's violence, who by accident, and that can happen to men or women very easily, you find yourself with a violent partner and you, for a long time, you don't quite know what's happening. They were the ones that were easy. Once they came in, they were easy because there was nothing wrong with them. They were able to mother their kids and move on and learn from what happened to them. But the women I was closest to were women who were like my mother, women who had appalling childhood histories and needed time and intervention and therapy. And so Chiswick became a very big therapeutic community. Men were very important in our refuges.
Would you like to tell me about the role of men, please?
The most important, the first time we got a little bit of money, because we all sat down and made decisions together. The only people who could make decisions were the people who were paying the rent in the house. I couldn't make decisions. I would have to ask the house. And the house sat down and we were all talking about the kind of men that the children knew in their lives. And they were all obviously violent, because even the women who were violent themselves, on the whole, the men were just as violent. But in a way, what you could see is that what we all agreed is the first bit of money we would pay a man to come and work directly with the children. And the mothers themselves said many of them didn't know good, gentle, kind men. They'd come from big, sprawling families where violence was epidemic right the way through the family. So that was our first employee. He came to work with the children. And then men volunteered to come and work with us. So always half the staff would be male.
Right. Was there any sort of pensiveness from the women who were seeking shelter about that?
No, why would there be? I mean, they all had brothers and cousins and men, and they had sons. I mean, some of the boys coming in were 18.
Well, I'm just asking because I don't want to inject myself into this, but my sister actually she works for a rape crisis centre, and one of the things that she makes one thing that I've objected to is the fact that they don't treat men, and then they have under government ordinance had to recently start providing services for men. And I asked her, well, do you have any men working there? I mean, maybe a man might want to speak to another man about this rather than speaking to a woman about this. It's, and I can understand why they would want to. And she said no, they refuse to hire any men based on the fact that the majority of the people that they treat are women, and they assume that these women wouldn't want to be around other men.
That's a very feminist assumption, isn't it? Because
Absolutely.
Feminists claim they don't want to be around men, but I can promise you some very prominent feminists I know are married and they still carry on.
Well, that's the reason I wanted to ask you that. It was very interesting that you say there was obviously they have husbands and brothers and fathers, and why would they be afraid of being around men? I mean, I think the difference is they know the individual who is abusing them isn't the same as all of the other men around them.
If you look at the definition of feminism and what they believe, any woman who calls herself a feminist will probably be thinking she's an equity feminist. She wants equality. Mm-hmm. What she doesn't need or know is the actual description, which is all women are innocent victims of men's violence. And this began, actually, the whole discussion about the new wave of the women's movement, the second wave, if you like, began in America among left-wing women. They were Marxist women, and they had actually decided to create this new women's liberation movement. And in that movement, all men, no longer would they fight with men on capitalism. That is no longer the enemy. The enemy would now become patriarchy, i.e. all men.
Yes.
That way, you have a ring-fenced movement of only women. Only women can work in refuges. Only women can actually run anything to do with refuge. And only women can take the millions and billions that are now spent on what is a huge, fraudulent feminist movement.
I think that's a very interesting... It's interesting you say they were left-wing Marxists,
Mm-hmm.
because one of I think my primary issues with feminism as an ideology, modern feminism, it's I mean, obviously anyone in opposition to feminism gets slurred as a misogynist. It's a smear that is just thankfully losing its power. But one of my problems is the collectivist nature of it and the idea that men and women are separate classes, which I find ridiculous.
Well, men are the oppressors, and women are the proletariat oppressed by.
Exactly, they're the bourgeois men and the proletariat women, which I personally find are ridiculous.
Well, the most ridiculous statement of all is the majority of these feminists are white middle-class women who are the most privileged across the world. That's the most ridiculous part of it.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is something else that so many other people have noticed. One of the issues we have at the moment are people who are sort of progressive activists, and they get colloquially called social justice warriors. And the irony of these people always fighting for the underprivileged is that they have so much privilege. They are often from wealthy backgrounds.
Yes.
They are very often people who have had all of the best starts in life, and often they have been, well, frankly, bad people. They've committed crimes. They've screwed over other people. They've maybe actually done something that's landed them with a criminal conviction, and it seems to be some kind of expunging of guilt that they take on this kind of activism with such fervour.
Well, I do say that the majority of the women who are leaders, or consider them, because the idea, of course, is there are no such thing as leaders, but there are leaders, and the point with most of them is actually they are personality disordered. I know a lot of them, and I promise you wouldn't want to know them.
Help. And I did try with the men's house, and I also spent a lot of time with men's groups. And what I did when the men's house failed is there was a very good woman who organised charity shops, which you have here, and it was called Men's Aid. And the idea was, with the money we made from the charity shops, that money went directly to employing people to see all the men who wanted our help and men who were innocent victims of their partner's violence. So we always had this branch of what we were doing, which recognised that men needed. But the problem is that as the years went by, and we're talking about 40 years ago, the women who were very radical are now in very powerful positions across the world. It's here and certainly almost everywhere. It's global now. And they're going to make sure that, as far as they're concerned, men are not going to have any kind of voice in this, which is why that I tried so hard. I came to Canada about 10 years ago with Senator Ann Cools, and we did a whole tour of Canada looking at the situation and talking to all the men's groups that we could visit right the way across to Vancouver. And Canada was really frightening, actually. It is more anti-male than any country I've ever visited. It's horrifying in many ways. And so I came back to England and then tried to make these connections. And I would go to Slovenia, and I went to Bermuda, interestingly enough, to a men's group there, always trying to actually get the men to understand that they needed to actually move together to get anything to change. Because you get these little tiny men's groups, but nothing like the networks that women do. What I want, I'm 74 now, before I die, is to see that this war, this gender war, is ended, and that we go back to the truth, and the truth has always been, it is generational violence from parents to children, and on, and this is where we need to be doing the work.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.